The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. This week, we're talking about trust, cooperation, and the social side of security. We're joined by security technologist Bruce Schneier to talk about his new book, Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust Society Needs to Survive. But first, let's talk about how your brain handles the demands of social networking. I'm here with returning champ Greg Laden, biological anthropologist and prolific science blogger both at Freethought Blogs and the creatively titled Greg Laden's blog. Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking, Greg.
Thanks. Great to hear from you.
Now, we're going to talk about a possible limit on the ability of people to form meaningful social relationships, as predicted by something called Dunbar's number. So, first off, who is Robin Dunbar?
Robin Dunbar is a British primatologist who did a lot of really important work originally in the 80s with other people summarizing data from a number of different primate species. He worked a lot with important behavioral biological theories, looking at how Darwinian theories predict behavior in social animals, social organisms, and published lots of stuff and became a pretty well-known, pretty famous primatologist by the time he published his first paper related to Dunbar's number, which I think was in 1992.
So what is Dunbar's number?
You have to go back a little bit to an earlier concept first, okay, because it arises from the idea, which was Dunbar first pointed out, was that the larger the group size for a primate species, the larger the typical group size, the larger the brain for that species relative to body size. So brainy monkeys and apes were in larger groups, and less brainy monkeys and apes were in smaller groups. Well, then, of course, this leads to the question of human group sizes. If in human history our group sizes got really big, we'd have to get larger brains. In other words, it was an evolutionary model for large brains in humans. Large brains, tool use, walking upright, things like that are all the constantly asked evolutionary questions, and this was yet another answer to the question of why humans have large brains. When the paper came out, it was widely hated and liked at the same time because he was both wrong and right about different things. The initial version probably had to be redone. The statistics were not really properly figured out, and it's always a problem when you compare primate groups. If you find something that all African forest monkeys do, it's not as impressive as if all apes do it, right? Because even though there's only a few species of apes, they're not that closely related to each other. Whereas all the African forest monkeys share common ancestors that are tens of thousands of years old or 100,000 years old, something like that. Imagine meeting a group of people that all wear the same color T-shirt on the same day. You would be pretty impressed if they randomly showed up at the bus stop. But you wouldn't be that impressed if they were all going to the same school where they wear a uniform, or if they're all members of the same family. Okay, so you have to compare primate groups carefully by considering which primates are related to each other closely versus not, and different diets relate to different body size issues and so on. The idea became controversial right away because it was such a hard idea to figure out, and was repeatedly criticized and republished and reworked. But eventually it does kind of work out. And there are extreme exceptions. Chimpanzees live in pretty big groups. Orangutans live in 0 groups. Their largest social size of an orangutan is 2, a mother and her infant. Yet orangutans are incredibly smart. So the group size and intelligence thing or brain size thing doesn't work out perfectly across primates. But it was an idea that suggested that since grooming was the main way that primates socially interacted, the larger the group that you had to groom with, the more time you'd have to spend grooming. Eventually you'd be doing nothing but grooming, and there would be no more mating or eating or anything else. So group size is a limitation on primate sociality. Group size is a limitation on how primates interact with each other. And that leads eventually to the idea of simply having a number that is the ceiling, before which your group becomes ineffective or has to split up or something else has to happen. And more recently, Robin has applied this to human society. So he's identified the number, which is anywhere between, I think the number is said to be something like between 90, is it, and 230, but the typical average number that's sort of picked is 150. As you approach 150, your human interaction sphere among humans where you're actually interacting becomes unwieldy. This is reflected in historical groups. All military, units around the different histories of the Zulu and the Romans and the Greeks and everybody else have a kind of unit, which we call a company, which is usually 100 people. Studies of fission of villages, like the Yanomamo in the Amazon, for example, when the villages are 70 or 80 in size, is a little bit too small to be productive. When they approach around 90 to 100, 110, they're extremely productive and they're safer from attack. But when you get up to around 140, conflicts emerge and there become more problems than it's worth being in that group, and the group will split down back to that 70 size again into two villages. So that 100 and something number seems to be something that limits the degree to which humans can interact at that level where you know them and interact with them, and you also have an understanding of their interactions. So you not only know who they are, but you have a concept of who their social relationships are as well.
Okay, so we've got an observed phenomenon in primate populations that seems to line up with patterns in both prehistoric and in modern humans. So why does this strike me as so remarkably speculative?
There's a couple of reasons why you would be suspicious of this kind of idea.
Very.
One is that anytime you have a simple number that applies to many species and many things, I mean, if you look at so-and-so's rule or so-and-so's law, like Newton's laws of physics or Allen's rule or Bergman's rule or Cope's law about body size and shape and numbers of species and all that stuff, those are all 19th century, most of those things. Back in the 19th century, it was people more commonly believed a simple relationship could be identified and formulated to explain a large range of phenomenon. And the two things that were true is, first of all, yes, that's true for some things, and they pretty much nailed them all down right away. But then even those things vary a great deal within that context. So even if you take 150 as Dunbar's number, by the way, Dunbar himself is not really happy about this thing called Dunbar's number. Like, he didn't name it that, other people did, and he's a little bit he's not going around pushing his number. But it isn't really a number that means when you get to it, it doesn't work. It's just like a lot of numbers are like this. When you get beyond a certain point, other things become more important. The relationship between group size, dynamics, or think about how big an animal can be before its skin has to get much too thick to allow it to exist, or its bones have to be too big. There are definitely relationships between sizes and shapes and amounts of things in nature where you just don't find things above a certain size, or you just don't find things below a certain size. And no one has really said what the size is for how big a quadrupedal animal can be. People used to say that, and then they found bigger animals. So we just know that as you approach a certain size, things are going to not work as often, and you're going to have only rare cases be that big. And you think of Dunbar's number that way, where a person in a society in which there's no electronic communication, and it's just face-to-face, and you have to accommodate the fact that people live mostly in family groups within a larger group, and people are living on a two-dimensional landscape and so on and so forth, and there's only 12 hours in a tropical day, plus or minus in temperate environments, depending on the season. You're just going to have so much ability to process social interactions that there's going to be a limit. And the limit is not 1 million. We don't have 1 million social interactions. It's not one. So it's somewhere between 1 and 1 million. And as you start narrowing it down, it's not that crazy to think of there being a range within which things become difficult.
Right.
Think of it that way. Somewhere between 50 and 300, things become difficult. So it's not so much as a number that you can't cross, because it really depends on the nature of the society, and you could have, assistants who help you take care of your interactions, or you could be a person who is just really bad at that, and your number is 4, or you could be someone who's really good at it, and you don't have a problem remembering everyone's name and keeping track of things. So the individual variation is huge. The nature of the society is going to make it very different. Is the society already split between males and females? Because your village could be much larger if you only interacted with half the people in it. So there's all kinds of different factors that come into play. It's not so much that the number is 150, is that there is a range within which social interactions become difficult to manage beyond a certain size of the society.
Well, and that's what I was sort of wondering. Isn't it possible that there are other reasons why primates or tribal populations could self-limit, like environmental factors or access to resources?
Here's the thing in favor of Dunbar's numbers. There's all these studies have been done about exactly what you just said. How closely related are you to your relatives in your patriline as your village gets bigger? And as your degree of relatedness to your patrilineal members approaches your degree of relatedness to just anybody, then your patriline ceases to become a genetic theory, a really valid strength. So village splits. That's the old theory for the Yanomama. Your village can't be bigger than 150 because the distance you have to go to get firewood for everyone to cook just becomes too large.
But Dunbar's number is specifically related to brain size, though.
Well, the thing is, the reason why Dunbar's number is better than genetics or firewood is because it applies to so many cases where those things don't matter. There's no genetics in a military system.
Right.
There's no firewood in a society that has unlimited supplies of firewood or something. But yeah, there's a brain size relationship, which brings us actually to the other thing that he's contributed, which is if you're just grooming, your number gets pretty big. The most groomy primates probably groom each other a little over 40% of their waking hours, which is a lot of time. And the biggest groups, I think, are the gelada baboons, and they talk. I mean, they don't have human language, but if you go hang out with gelada baboons, they're just chattering constantly to each other. So in other words, they've added a vocalization, sort of like birds do that live in flocks, like parrots. Mm-hmm. They've added vocalization to their grooming. So they can live in groups of 600 monkeys or some huge number of monkeys and still kind of have social interactions that mediate the group dynamics by going beyond touching each other, by making little noises at each other, like birds do. So that's an additional thing that they do. So in other words, when you get close to these numbers, things might be selected for that are novel, large brains being one of them. The interesting thing that Dunbar's working on more recently, which comes out of this work, I mentioned before, you have to know the person to count as one of your Dunbar numbers, and you have to understand something about their relationships to other people also, right? There's this idea that there's a kind of meta relationship that you understand as humans. That's, for example, deer or bison or a lot of other mammals don't really get. But that is like, I understand that you are a friend of mine, so we're going to have friendly interactions. But there might be a level at which something you decide to ask me to do might be something you want me to do because there's someone else you'd like to ingratiate.
Right.
And it turns out that I knew that you might ask me that because I understand that that person is a friend of yours, and I was expecting this to happen, and I already had a plan whereby I was going to actually get more brownie points than everyone by doing this thing before you even asked me. In other words, the meta level of thinking about things.
How does one test that?
Well, the way you test it is you see if chimpanzees can do any of this. Can chimpanzees kind of think of what the other chimps are doing and strategically act on relationships that they don't see and that are meta to their current relationship? The very simple version of this is the very basic idea is, can I understand at all what's going on in your mind? And that's the basic thing that was ineptly named theory of mind. It's not a theory of mind. It's a thing called, I have a theory, what's in your mind? You know, so there's a classic example where the child is shown a scene, and in the scene, a person or whatever hides a candy bar and then leaves the room, and someone comes in and moves the candy bar to a different hiding place, and then the person comes back, and then the child is asked, where will this person look for the candy bar? And below a certain age, they say this person will look where it is, because they just assume everyone else knows what they know. But when you reach a certain developmental stage, like 5 years old or something, you now know that the person who left the room couldn't know where the candy bar is. So in their mind, their understanding of the candy bar is wrong, and they will look in the wrong place. That's called theory of mind. It's a very basic level of me knowing what's in your mind at a level that puts you as in an individual status, and so I'm understanding not just my relationship to you, but your relationship to other parts of the world as being different than mine. What Dunbar points out is that the things we find most entertaining and engaging socially are things where these get complicated. It has been said that in social interactions and political interactions and so on, everything is connected to everything else. There's no simple place where people just look at one issue and discuss it and decide what to do about it. All the people sitting at the table trying to decide what to do have their own agendas. They have their own things that they're thinking about. And these are things that might relate to other people in the room or might not. It's all very complicated. We can only do that because we have this ability to have a sort of a meta story. When you think about literature, children's literature, you go out looking for a bear, you find the bear, growls at you, you run home. That's a children's story. It's a pretty complicated children's story. If you read a P.D. James novel, you've got layers of people knowing things and not knowing things. The most interesting literature is often that in which we know things that the people in the stories don't know, but they know things that we don't know also. And there's strategies, Machiavellian and otherwise, on top of strategies that make the whole thing very interesting. So when you get to the conclusion of one part of the story and everything seems sewn up, turns out there's an underlying thing you didn't know about that now changes the entire plot. That's what we find interesting. And those are the things that, if you have the ability to handle a meta story, then probably, this goes back to some old, thinking about how brains work. If you can handle any level of meta story, then you can handle all levels. And our brain is in fact evolved in such a way that it has this big region called the prefrontal region, which is very large in humans, doesn't really exist in monkeys. And people who have damage in that area can't figure these things out. They can't understand. They don't get that complicated novel or the interesting meta story, or ironies and that kind of thing. And so what we can do is we can organize that basic primate substrate of, I can understand what my 30 or 40 main other primates are doing as long as we're grooming each other. That's pretty much it. I know which sex they are. I know which ones are sexually receptive, and I know that I'm a male or a female, and so is that one. To another level of political organization where we are actually managing that information at a meta level. And when we look at chimps, they can do that sort of a little, but really not like humans do. And once you have that ability to do it at all, you probably have the ability to do it at many different levels. And that's sort of a difference between one person and the other, and the things they know about, the things they're interested in.
Now that makes far more sense to me than Dunbar's numbers. So how would one test Dunbar's numbers then?
Well, this is a little difficult because, Dunbar did have a long career before he got to the number thing. And if he was somebody who just came out of nowhere with a number, it might have been dismissed more quickly. Because what you do when you have a number like this is you go around and you find it. I know a guy who's actually got he's got a number too. And his number, I think, is a valid number, but I'm one of the people who promoted his number and got him to publish on it. And his number is how much something weighs to be easily handled as a tool. And by looking at the numbers, the distribution of rocks on really, really old archaeological sites, you can identify cases where the hominids that lived there, the chimpanzee-like Australopithecines that lived there, may have carried rocks to the site because they're going to be within the range of his number. But he's not an anthropologist. He's an engineer. And he's gotten completely shunned by the anthropological community because he's just some guy who has his number.
So that's what happened with Dunbar, except
No,
he had a background?
Dunbar has this huge background,
Right.
and but he has a number. But again, I think his theories are valid. And I just think his number, you can't take his number too seriously, and neither does he. The number isn't that important. It's just that there's this, as you move in a certain direction, and the number of interactions you have to maintain on a regular basis goes up, it's limited, just in some way at some point. That's the key factor there. It is more simplistic than the meta story,
Right.
meta scenario. And they're different, except that as the number goes up, the opportunities for meta scenarios and their importance goes up, and the way you manage really large numbers of interactions. So a meta scenario for chimpanzees would be chimpanzee groups interact somewhat violently. Different groups with different home ranges will fight at their edges and murder each other habitually over many years of time. And then every once in a while, when ecological pressures dictate, one group that is larger will really actually attack the other group and kill as many as they can, take over their territory for a period of time. Now, a meta scenario for chimpanzee groups would be to form alliances between two groups and attack a third group.
Right.
They don't do that. We don't think they do that. Humans do that routinely. Not only that, but we strategize who marries whom in order to have alliances between groups that we were formerly enemies with, so that we can attack a group that we're currently friendly with that we know we're going to be enemies with in the future.
Okay, so even if you could test Dunbar's number, and if it turns out that there does seem to be some sort of limit on the size of social networks, is there any way to determine if the brain is the culprit? That's my question.
The way that Dunbar would do this is by comparing across primates and seeing where those numbers. Then there is a relationship between brain size and group size in primates. Once you adjust for a lot of things, leaf-eating monkeys have larger bodies, so you have to adjust the brain size because it's not fair. And you have to compare old world monkeys and new world monkeys. You have to use an adjustment because they're so different in their evolutionary history that they may not have the same exact relationships within them. And you can't easily throw apes and monkeys in the same chart either. So you have to do all these adjustments. When you do that, you do find that his basic relationship of brain size and group number is describes the primate species, the 280 primate species, whatever you might put in this list, reasonably well. So there is evidence there's a brain size factor. However, the reason why the sort of executive function and the meta story, which really is a unique human feature, would have emerged is because as we approach a number like Dunbar's number, this scenario I mentioned before where you have villages forming alliances, the number goes from 150 back down to 4. You're no longer interacting with 150 people, you're interacting with 4 groups of people. Or maybe there's 20 people involved in this sort of political interaction you're doing. So that's just the model. You can't test that. The way to test it would be to find other groups of linguistic apes that aren't humans that have different brain sizes and somewhat different group structure.
Well,
6 or 7 of those that are different enough and make a chart and show brain size and group size and interactions and so on. And we can't do that. The closest thing we have are chimpanzees, which are near the other great apes, I suppose. And they basically don't have this large-scale meta-scenario executive function that humans have. It's completely unique to us. So this is always a problem in human evolution. It's always the problem. The central questions of human evolution have always been, things like tool use, bipedalism, and brain size. And they are so utterly unique to humans. I mean, kangaroos and birds are bipedal, but not in the way that humans are. Crows use tools, but the whole neuro and technological context of tool use by birds is fundamentally different than humans. Humans are unique in their tool use. They're unique virtually. They're unique in bipedalism. They're unique in their large brain. They're unique in all these things. So you can never make the comparison. So almost all of the stories we come up with humans are really just stories, and it's about making the story. My advisor back in graduate school, Glenn Isaac, always said, make a list of explanations, and your job as a scientist is to make a list of explanations and then get rid of as many things in the list as you can, and then you're going to have a list that from that list you can create your stories. It's the list that is plausible and not disproven, and that's as far as you can go with a lot of these things.
Your field is very frustrating, Greg.
It is, and for those major areas of large brain, bipedalism, and tool use, those lists, since I heard that first from Glenn Isaac in 1985, those lists have not shortened. They've changed what's on them. We've added things and removed them, but they're all about 6 or 7 items long, and they're always going to be that way.
Greg, thank you for trying to help me sort that out.
I just think in closing, Dunbar's number is not a magic number, but it is an interesting and potentially useful concept.
You'll find a link to Greg Laden's blog on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. And we'll be right back with author Bruce Schneier to talk about his book, Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust Society Needs to Survive, right after this.
Skeptically Speaking wants you to question everything. To be a part of the discussion, call and record your question on our listener question line at Speak 73101. That's 773-257-3101. Long-distance charges may apply. Sunday nights at 6 Mountain Time, join our Ustream chat room to listen and ask questions as we record interviews live. Just click the Listen Online button at skepticallyspeaking.com. You can also email your questions and comments to live@skepticallyspeaking.com, or if you're on Twitter, tweet us at Skeptical Radio. To find out where Skeptically Speaking airs near you, to listen to past episodes, or download the weekly podcast, check out our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, follow the links to connect with us on our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, or to subscribe to the show in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell. I'm here with Bruce Schneier, an internationally renowned security technologist that The Economist magazine has called a security guru. He's the Chief Security Technology Officer of BT and the author of 12 books, including his latest bestseller, Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust Society Needs to Survive. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, your new book starts out giving readers a background of the history of security, and you talk about a number of evolutionary adaptations being related to security. Maybe explain that?
Sure. And the question I'm trying to answer in the book really is why security exists. Rocks don't have it. What is it about life that requires security? That leads us to talk about not only evolution, but the struggle to live and reproduce. As soon as one animal realizes he can eat another, you have an attacker and a defender. And evolution has been an endless series of security adaptations, predator and prey. As soon as you have competition for mates, you have other security issues, right? How do I live long enough to reproduce? Or if I'm, top dog or lion, how do I ensure that my competitors don't reproduce? So when I look at security, I see a very long and rich history on our planet of survival and propagation. Now, humans, of course, take that to another level, being a social species. And, I look at that also. What is it about our socialization that requires security? And really that's how I get to trust.
Well, and our, I guess one would say, uniquely human intelligence did lead to developing more effective methods of deception and concealment, methods that we could teach from generation to generation.
Well, there's a lot. An obvious one is reputation. A lot of my dealings with other people are informed by their reputation, how they've dealt with me in the past. And that is not uniquely human. Other primates, other mammals, some birds keep reputational information about other individuals and use that to make a decision. And so that's not unique. But humans are the only species that can transfer reputational information. Right? I can tell you about somebody else. And that's uniquely human. And there are researchers who believe that language developed initially for this purpose, which is essentially gossip, information about other people. That being able to do that allows us to increase our socialization to an extent never seen on the planet before.
Well, and every bit of increased socialization leads to an increased need for security.
Certainly complexity does, right? As our societies get larger, as they get more technological, they get more complex, and more complex societies do have more security needs. What works for a family group or for a small tribe wouldn't work in a big city. Or take an easier example, a small company, everyone knows each other, company gets larger, suddenly you need name badges, right? Because you need some way to authenticate this person's in our company, even though you don't know them. But yeah, as things grow, there's more need for security, there's more need for formalism, right? A family doesn't need laws, but a larger community does. So there's a lot of complexity that comes into security through group size.
Well, maybe we should clarify at this point, because we're throwing around a lot of terms here. Does the term security encompass both things like weapons and deception and such, but also cooperation and mutual aid and the ability to trust the people in your group?
So these are actually very hard words. I mean, the words security and trust are extremely overloaded in language. I mean, they have a lot of different meanings. The book is fundamentally about trust, how we induce trust in society, how we force people to be trustworthy. And there's several different definitions of trust, right? There's sort of a personal, intimate trust. You might trust a friend or a family member or a spouse. That really doesn't mean you know what they'll do. That means you know who they are. You know them as a person, and you trust that whatever their actions are, they will be informed by who they are as a person. But that's not the kind of trust I mean. I'm right now in New York City, and I landed this morning, and I took a taxi from the airport to my hotel. I trusted the taxi driver. I didn't know who he was. I mean, he might be a burglar at night. I didn't care. I trusted he would get me to my hotel and not overcharge me. So that's the sort of trust I'm writing about. That's the trust that makes society work. It's really more about compliance and confidence. It's very limited. I'm trusting his actions within the context of our interaction. And this is the sort of trust that security enables. So security, in the way I'm writing it, is anything that forces, cajoles, enables, allows, incents that taxi driver to drive me to my hotel and not overcharge me. I'm casting a very broad net. That could be anything that does that.
Well, and that's also very unique to humans because trust is rare among animals, especially if they aren't related.
Right. There's several pathways to trust, and there's some really good evolutionary biology research on the evolution of trust. Certainly genetic relation, right? Ants, bees. In hives, individuals will sacrifice their lives for each other. There's an enormous amount of trust, but they are genetic copies of each other. So there's a very, very easy way for that sort of trust to develop. In individuated social species, it's harder. There's been a lot of debate on how that develops. Why is it that we trust strangers? And some of it is short-term versus long-term thinking. Let's get back to that taxi driver. Taxi driver's thinking, well, I can rob this guy, but then, police are going to be called and I might get arrested. Might be in my short-term interest to get his wallet, but it's in my long-term interest to be, an honest cab driver. So humans are not unique in that kind of social trust, but we take it to a level that's never been seen. You can see this other kind of trust in other primates, in pack animals, or animals that hunt in packs. There's trust, but it's not to the level of humans. When I give a lecture on this in person, I'll mention that everyone in the room is sitting there listening to me give a lecture, and nobody is attacking each other. It's even unremarkable. But a room full of chimpanzees couldn't get away with that. We are the only species that will sit quietly in groups and listen to each other.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking to Bruce Schneier, security technologist and author of the new bestseller, Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust Society Needs to Survive. So then how do we decide who to trust?
Well, it's very social. We have a lot of evolutionary tools. And some of it is looking at someone's face, at seeing how they act. We're very responsive. So if someone acts kind to us, we're likely to reciprocate. Some of it's cultural. Right? I'm in New York City, and I sort of know the taxi drivers are honest. Last week I was in Moscow, and I was a little more hesitant about getting into a taxi. Right? So that's a cultural signal. We do get all these signals on how to trust, and we often decide in our gut. And this may or may not be good. If you sort of think about what confidence tricksters do, is they play on our natural trust cues and subvert them in order to make a profit. So a lot of our systems, which evolved when we were living in small family groups in the East African highlands in 500,000 BC, might not work as well in 2012 New York City.
We have a question from the audience. It's from Evil Eye Monster.
Why do people have such a problem understanding the difference between faith and trust? Faith being belief with no evidence, and trust being provisional belief based on previous evidence.
I do think the concepts are muddied. We often trust without much conscious evidence, and trust does in some sense require a leap of faith. So I think there's enough overlap in the concepts that precise definitions might not work as well in real-world situations. Yes, we can say we trust the sun will rise in the morning. We don't have faith that it will. But, how much of that is real and how much of that is semantic? So I'm not sure that's a difference that makes much of a difference. I understand what the questioner is asking. But when you think about real situations, there are elements of faith and there are elements of trust.
Now, maybe one of the ways that you could illustrate this is something that you used in your book, the hawk-dove game. Could you explain that?
It's a thought experiment and it's a simulation. And what it looks at is the difference between a cooperative strategy and an uncooperative strategy, and an attacking strategy, or sharing strategy and a stealing strategy. And the way the experiment works is you have an imaginary population, and they divide them into two categories, hawks and doves. And doves share with each other, hawks fight with each other, and hawks steal from doves. And then they get imaginary food, and you run this population, they interact with each other, and you sort of see what happens. If an entire population of doves, everybody shares and everybody thrives. An entire population of hawks, they fight, they steal from each other, and occasionally hawks die from battle. In mixed populations of hawks and doves, depending on your initial mix, you either end up with all hawks, right? Hawks just steal food from the doves, and the doves die. But if there are few enough hawks, then there's a stable population of hawks and doves, right? So there are some hawks that are stealing, most doves that are sharing, and that's stable. And what that illustrates, I mean, why this is such a powerful metaphor, is it sort of shows the way the world works. I mean, in real-world situations, most of us are kind, sharing, generous, trusting, but some of us take advantage of that. But if the number of hawks is low enough, hawks can survive, can thrive in a mostly dove society. And you never get to a point where it's all doves. There'll always be some hawks, right? Which sort of means in any society there'll always be some antisocial behavior, right? There'll be some level of theft, some level of murder, some level of stealing, taking too much at a buffet, whatever that is. You will never get the number of hawks down to zero.
Well, and realistically, no one is 100% hawk or 100% dove.
Oh, no, it really is just a simple simulation. I mean, when you sort of turn it into the real world, yes, no one's 100% one or the other. There could, of course, be different degrees of hawkishness. Just because you steal pennies from a penny jar doesn't mean you're going to steal something bigger or kill somebody. I mean, but it really is just a computational biology experiment that lets you see how the two different strategies interplay.
So if it's a cost-benefit analysis for each person, well, would you say security as a concept is basically about trying to control for that?
I use the term societal pressure. And what it is, it's a way to modify that. So, for example, in a cost-benefit analysis of the taxi driver, we'll get back to him, whether he's going to take me to my destination or he's going to try to rob me. And he's going to make a cost-benefit analysis, right? A versus B. Security, let's take one mechanism would be a law that makes it illegal for cab drivers to steal from passengers, and it's enforced, and there's jail time. That law effectively affects his cost-benefit decision, right? It raises the cost of him stealing from me, so he's less likely to do it. And you could look at all security measures in that way. And it doesn't mean it's explicit, doesn't mean it's conscious. It could be very emotional. But, there's going to be some weighing at some part in the brain, should I do this or not? And these security measures, like a law, sort of make it more likely for that cab driver to be cooperative, which in this case means take me to my destination and don't overcharge me, than it would be for him to be to break the rule or be selfish, which is basically steal from me.
We have a question from the chat from Jeff.
Is American politics running an imbalance of large hawks and small doves in Congress?
It's really funny. There was actually a research paper on this that looked at the different incentives of politicians in a geopolitical context, and did conclude that hawkish behavior is rewarded more in politics. I mean, this is not American politics. This is not, 2012 Congress. This is very much in general. That when you look at countries going to war versus countries, working it out and remaining at peace, there is the incentive to be more hawkish. And you see those same incentives when you look at rulers of countries, tribal leaders. You'll see it in the alpha males and in chimpanzees, that we do seem to select for hawkish behavior in our leaders. Now, this might not, the argument is, maybe this isn't a good thing, but it does seem to be true. It's a really perceptive question, whoever asked that.
Okay, so we do have people who are not going to participate in that. We are going to have people who are defectors. So maybe explain that term.
So the central metaphor in the book is the prisoner's dilemma, which I probably don't want to go into details. It'll take too long, but it is a way of looking at hawks versus doves, and it looks at them in terms of cooperators, which would be the doves, or defectors, which would be the hawks. The cooperators will share, will basically follow the social norms, and the defectors will break the social norm. And the prisoner's dilemma is an extremely powerful metaphor because it really shows how people can make rational decisions individually and get to an outcome that is irrational for the group. And so the way to think of this is that in any system of cooperation, there is always a non-cooperative strategy, a parasitical strategy. And that could be tapeworms in a digestive tract, it could be thieves in a market, it could be spam on email, it could be people who don't pay taxes. Now, parasites are only able to survive if they're not too successful. And the hawk-dove game predicts this. If there are too many hawks, the system collapses. Right? Too many parasites in the digestive tract, and you die and they die. Too many thieves in the market closes down, the thieves starve. Too much spam on email, everyone says, we don't read email anymore, it's too much spam. So no one reads the spam. Too many people don't pay the taxes, society collapses. So there is that tension. Now, if you think about it, I'm better off if I steal your stuff, but I'm actually much better off if I live in a society where nobody steals, because it's a much better society. But I'm really better off if I, A, live in a society where nobody steals and I steal your stuff. Right? I get the benefits of both. Right? That's the hawk strategy.
But you use the term defector you use it as a value-neutral term.
Right. I'm really looking at how a group enforces group norms. And I'm not looking at the absolute morality of the group. So the group, we're really talking about the group being society and the group norms being, good social lawful behavior. But we could easily be talking about a group of criminals, right, the mafia, and the group behavior we want to enforce is not going to the police and ratting on your fellow criminal. The same mechanisms work, whether we're talking about a moral group or immoral group. Right? If the group norm is to keep slaves, the cooperative behavior is to keep slaves, and the corresponding defective behavior is to go free the slaves, which would in absolute terms be more moral, but in terms of the group norm, it's defecting.
And I really find this valuable. It is not necessarily about your own self-interest. It's just about circumventing the norms.
Right. What I like about the work I did is that I think this is a valuable way of looking at societal issues. I'm a security guy, so I sort of perceive the world through a security lens. And I think this way of looking at society and society's problems and the mechanisms by which we get to solutions is interesting. And in the book I apply this model to terrorism, to the financial crisis of 2008, to organized crime, to internet crime. And I think there's value at a policy level of thinking about issues in this way.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking to Bruce Schneier, security technologist and author of the new bestseller, Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust Society Needs to Survive. And we'll be right back with more of that after this.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we're talking about the basic biological impulses that drive our technological advancement. We're joined by author and journalist Peter Nowak to discuss his book, Sex, Bombs, and Burgers, How War, Porn, and Fast Food Shaped Modern Technology. And we'll talk to John Zeller, founder of Penny for NASA, a petition project to increase funding for space exploration in the U.S. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking, on your local radio station, or online at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell. My guest today is Bruce Schneier, security technologist whose influential newsletter Cryptogram and his blog Schneier on Security are read by over 250,000 people. He's the author of the new bestseller Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust Society Needs to Survive. So you touched on this earlier, the idea of pressures, the various kinds of pressures that are used to ensure that people don't defect or at least don't put their needs ahead of the groups too often. So maybe just talk about societal pressures.
Sure, and this is a term I coined to really encompass anything that pressures someone to be cooperative. And I have four main types. The first one is morals. Right? Most of us don't steal, not because it's illegal, but because we feel bad if we do. So by morals, I mean anything that's in our heads that will push us in one direction or the other. So it's feelings of guilt and shame. On the other side, it's feelings of fairness, caring, niceness. And it's a combination of nature and nurture. There's a lot here that I'm encompassing in the word morals. So it's stuff in our head that push us in one direction. The second I've mentioned before is reputation. A lot of the time we behave cooperatively because of what other people would think. Right? And we are a very social species. We're very concerned with our reputation. We're concerned with the reputations of others. We take pains to make sure our reputation stays clean. And this is another very informal system. I invite a friend over to my house and he steals my sweater. I'm not going to call the police. I'm just not going to invite him over anymore.
Right.
His reputation as a sweater thief or an obnoxious bore or whatever, right? Means he will be, in extreme cases, socially ostracized. So morals and reputation, evolve together, and that's pretty much our primitive societal pressure toolkit. That's what worked in primitive society. You can see those work in other primates. It's actually a really great experiment that shows how deep this is. The experiment is at a self-service honesty box coffee pot in an office. You know how this works. There's a pot of coffee, and you take a cup and you put a quarter in the box. And nobody's watching. It's all in the honor system. But you can measure this, right? At the end of the day, you could watch, see how much coffee was used. You can count up the money and figure out what percentage of people paid. So you can look at cooperatives versus defectors. You can see the number. What the experimenters did, this is beautiful, is they put a photograph of a pair of eyes behind the coffee pot. And they found that increased payment substantially. Just being reminded that someone might be watching made people more honest. That's
kind of disturbing, really.
But it sort of shows how in tune we are at that. What will other people think?
Right.
So those are the first two, morals and reputation. My third societal pressure, and we've talked about it before here, is institutional. It's laws. Laws are very much formalized reputation. Right? We as a group decide what good behavior means. We codify it. We prescribe punishments. We delegate a subset of us to enforce those rules, and that allows society to grow. The fourth are security systems, right? Door locks, burglar alarms. So it's interesting. I do security for a living, mostly computer security and technology, and we work in that fourth layer. But it turns out all are important, right? Most people don't steal because it's wrong. A bunch more don't steal because what other people would think. Even more, they don't steal because if they do, they'll go to jail. And then way up that teeny little slice who are still not dissuaded, we get a door lock. So traditional security is just concerned with a very narrow piece of total security.
And so how do these kind of pressures, specifically moral and reputational, how do they fail?
Well, we sort of know how they fail, right? There are people, sociopaths would be the extreme example, who don't care about morals. They don't always work. If it's just morals, there are people who have competing morals. Killing is wrong, but these people are of a bad religion, therefore killing is okay, as an example.
Right.
Same thing with reputation. Right? Stealing is wrong. Other people think badly of us, but I'm in a criminal gang, and if I steal, people think better of me. Right? So there are competing morals, there are competing reputations. There are people who take advantage of it, confidence tricksters. We've talked about that, who deliberately fake their reputation in order to steal from you. I mean, there are lots of ways this fails, and there are ways technology helps. I think, eBay feedback is a reputational security system, and there have been ways people have tried to game it over the years. Yelp, another web-based reputational system on different businesses. The whole credit rating system is a reputational security system. So, at least in the United States, we'll have credit scores. It used to be if I wanted a loan to buy a house, I'd go to a bank where the bank manager knew me, and he would give me a loan or not, depending on my reputation, depending on my ability to repay. So that's been replaced by a database and a score that allows me to go to a bank anywhere in the country, apply for a loan, and it's also a reputational system. Right? There's this credit score based on a bunch of historical data. You can argue whether it's better or worse, but it did allow banking to scale nationally. And so, when you start looking at these systems, you see all sorts of ways they succeed, they fail, they can be made to fail. It's really a very rich and robust societal pressure security mechanism. Morals, people have actually seen the development of writing as a technology that assisted morals. I mean, it allowed cultures to write down their moral code, right, to codify it, and then pass it from generation to generation, which is a huge advance.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking to Bruce Schneier, security technologist and author of the new book, Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust Society Needs to Survive. So let's talk about a specific security issue for a moment. You've had a debate going with neurologist Sam Harris about racial profiling. He says use it, and you say it doesn't work. So maybe just if you could give us some background on that.
Yeah, I mean, he posted an essay on his blog that said basically, look, Muslims are the bad guys at airports. We know what they look like. If we see a Muslim, we should have more security, and if we see someone who's obviously not a Muslim, we should let them through with less security. Actually, he published the essay, got a lot of negative comments. Mm-hmm. A bunch of them says he should talk to Bruce Schneier. So he emailed me and said, hey, right, I wrote this, and everyone says I should talk to you for the opposing opinion. Let's have a discussion, and we'll post it. I wrote back and said, I'm in the process of writing a rebuttal to your essay. Let me finish my rebuttal. You can post that, and then we'll see what happens. So I wrote a rebuttal to his essay that basically said that profiling doesn't make sense, that it doesn't make us safer. And I looked at the cost-benefit analysis and gave a bunch of reasons why in airports profiling people who look Muslim, whatever that ends up meaning, doesn't make us safer. And then after that, we engaged in a dialogue, which he posted as a debate on whether this is a good idea or not. And I mean, it's a couple of things that we've talked about in this discussion here. That we don't know what the profile looks like. We have many examples of non-Muslim looking Muslims that are being actively tracked by U.S. intelligence. Someone can take pains to hide his ethnicity, through dress, through hair coloring, many different ways. Implementing a system like that is complicated and really causes more security vulnerabilities than it solves. And the interesting conclusion is that even though that screening grandma doesn't make sense because grandma's not likely a Muslim terrorist, it does make more sense to do it. That profiling actually makes us less safe.
And we actually will link to that from our website.
Thank you.
We have a question from Ryan, sort of in the same area.
You recently debated former TSA Administrator Kip Hawley about the TSA's history and effectiveness. One of his positions is that even the security rules that were ineffective or wasteful promoted public confidence because they were visible. You have largely panned this as security theater. What security rules would you propose that would not only be effective and efficient, but also visible, so the public gets to see the positive impact?
The whole visibility argument, I think, is largely a red herring, because airport security really shouldn't be in the business of being a therapist. And if someone is scared and needs to feel better, they should actually go see a therapist. They shouldn't go to the airport, see a bunch of visible rules that don't do any good, and then feel better. It's a very expensive way of making someone feel better. We have more efficient mechanisms for that. Generally, when I think about airport security, my goal is to build security measures that don't depend on the tactic or target for their effectiveness. Anything that's specific is much less effective because the bad guy can switch.
Right.
To an extreme example, if we spend billions of dollars a year securing airports and the terrorists go bomb shopping malls, we're no safer. So yes, airports and airplanes require some extra protection for a bunch of reasons, but in general, investigation, intelligence, and emergency response is what I want to invest in. Things that don't require guessing the plot correctly. We saw that with the foiling of the most recent plot out of Saudi Arabia. Right? That plot was specifically designed to get around airport security. It was foiled before the bad guy got to the airport, right? And it didn't matter what the plot was. Right? That's good security. Screening liquids and making you take off your shoes. If the terrorists don't put a bomb in shoes or liquids, we're wasting our time.
And another question from Ryan, and he actually gets two questions because he was the listener that requested we interview you, and that's the rule.
What cryptographic tools do you recommend for the average person? What would you suggest everyone, even technologically illiterate people, should do at a minimum to protect themselves in an increasingly digital world?
There's a lot of it's nothing to do with cryptography. I think people should all be encrypting their laptops, and it's very easy to do. There's integrated software in the operating system that will encrypt your hard drive. What this basically means is if you lose your computer, you don't have to worry about someone stealing the data. It's easy to do. It's painless. It doesn't slow your computer down. So I recommend people doing that. Beyond that, run a good antivirus program, pay attention, and don't do stupid things on the net. But largely
common sense
that's
kind
pretty
of
much
things.
all we get. It is really common sense kind of things.
So one of the problems that you mentioned in the book that I did find really interesting was that there really is a security lag. Defectors will always be finding new ways to game the system. And this is only going to get worse as technology improves?
Well, when I look at it as an arms race, right, between the attacker and defender. The attacker comes up with a new technique and the defender responds, and that goes on and on. And in a world where technology changes, right, new technologies can either favor the attacker or defender. Right? Someone invents a new type of handgun, someone invents fingerprint technology, but in general, most new technologies favor the attacker first because he is just faster. An example might be someone invents the motor car, and the police say, well, we can use a motor car, and they have a committee to figure out whether they need one, and they go out for bids, and they figure out how to buy a car, and they buy it. They have a training program. Meanwhile, the criminal says, oh, look, new getaway vehicle, and uses it immediately. Right? We saw this on the Internet. As soon as banking appears on the Internet, you had a new type of criminal appear immediately to take advantage of Internet commerce and start stealing things. Meanwhile, the police, who have been trained on Agatha Christie novels, took about 7 or 8 years to catch up. So there is always this lag. And the lag seems to increase, A, as technology increases, and B, in times of rapid technological change. And we are living in a world with more technology than ever before and also with greater technological change than ever before. So at least in the near term, we are going to see this dynamic where the attackers make use of these new technologies first and the defenders play catch-up.
Well, on that disturbing note, Bruce, great to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
And you can find Bruce Schneier, author of Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust Society Needs to Survive, at the link on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. And again, we will also link that to the debate between Bruce and Sam Harris. And while you're on the website, why not click the links to Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, and also to iTunes, where you can listen to past episodes or subscribe to the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.